I'm really excited to be able to share some of this material with you today. What we're going to try to do is first begin to understand what it means to think in systems, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on that, perhaps even to an excessive feeling it might have at first, but it will make sense overall. We'll then begin to apply the systems thinking, specifically using a text and thinking about systems within Judaism itself, and then we'll end with kind of looking about moving beyond the theory and just the idea. How do we actually use this as points of leverage? So just to give you a sense of the flow that we're going to go through before I get into that, let me just share a little about myself. I'm from, she said, Houston, Texas. This is a picture of me and my family at Camp Young Judea, Texas. Young Judea was always a big part of my life. Those are my folks in back. My dad actually was the national president of Young Judea from 69 to 70, and he's from New York, and met my mom at camp. She's from Texas, and so that's how come we all moved down south. My little sister Naomi, as well as myself and my older sister, all had our B'nai Mitzvot at camp. And when Naomi had hers, this gentleman off to the right, his name is Mark, was the assistant camp director. And at that point, he and my sister were already becoming friendly, we shall say. And so my sister sitting next to him, they actually also got married at camp. So it very much had a big influence on my life. He was actually also my counselor when I was going into 7th grade. So, you know, that's a little where I'm coming from. As mentioned, I went to undergrad at the University of Texas at Austin. After I got out of school, I spent a year in Central and South America trying to learn a little bit of Spanish and get a little perspective. And when I came back, I ended up teaching at the Emory Wiener School in Houston, Texas. Emory Wiener School is a community school, which is a wonderful euphemism for not orthodox in American culture. That's what community means. Though the Orthodox schools always hate that because, no, we're a community school. Everybody's welcome. So I taught there for 3 years. I taught Jewish studies, basic introduction foundation to 9th grade. I taught 10th grade what's called a vertically aligned curriculum. So as opposed to going Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, 2, 3, chapter 2, a vertically aligned curriculum is when you take an idea and you follow it as that idea develops through the Bible, through the Torah, through the prophets, through the rabbinic writings, and even into the present day. I also taught the history of modern Israel at that time. I love Texas, I miss Texas. However, it was time to do something different, and the opportunity came up to study at the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. But before I did that, I went to University of Houston. And while I was in University of Houston, I began a master's in what's called future studies. It's also called strategic foresight, which has the advantage of not implying in rising up ideas of tea leaves and crystal balls. Future studies, strategic foresight, is the art of long-range planning. It's very much about trying to find the right questions to be able to help us think, not just simply 6 months down the road, but 5 years. 5 years in futures is considered short term. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, what are the most important things that we need to plan for? There's an idea of what's called the cone of possibility. So if you want to begin planning, you make a baseline future. If all things were to remain constant going into the future, then this is what it would look like. And then the farther out you get, it becomes a wider cone, because you have to realize that the only certainty is that the future that you plan for will not actually happen. And it was while studying futures that I was introduced to systems thinking. Systems thinking, we'll come to in a moment, you'll see the slide, is a way of understanding complexity. It's a way of trying to understand the universe around us. So while I was still having this idea ping-ponging in my mind, just going back and forth, I put that master's on hold and I came to Israel. For 2 years I studied at the Hartman Institute, and in conjunction with Tel Aviv University. I have one last paper and I'll have a master's in Jewish philosophy, and I also received a second certificate of education from Hartman. So the whole time I was at Hartman, I was going through this idea of trying to figure out, I knew that there had to be an intersection between Judaism and systems thinking. Because as when you look at systems, when you begin to think in terms of systems, you realize that everything is a system. And when you do that, you realize that Judaism is not in that respect unique. Everything is a system. That Hinduism, Americanism, North Americanism, everything can be comprised and understood within systems. So I want to take a moment. This is not going to be teacher-centered. You guys are going to have to contribute, so I hope you're prepared for it. What are the systems that have allowed for this particular summit to happen? We're going to say a bunch of them, so even if you don't feel like it's the right one, don't be shy. What are the systems that have allowed for this summit to happen?
Philanthropic systems.
Philanthropic systems. So there's funding systems, right? How did they gather the money to be able to bring it all together? Great.
Communications.
Communication systems. Go on. What do you mean?
The internet. That's how you find out about stuff, but also
sure.
Connect and create, not that I actually use it. But, you know,
right. Connect and create is definitely a system.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Global Judaism.
Global Judaism. I want to get even more particular, though, specifically on this summit. ROI. What are the systems of ROI? ROI is obviously a system of its own.
Tikkun Olam.
Tikkun Olam.
In the sense of that there's a lot of stuff around social entrepreneurship, and so, you know, that's connected to the whole concept of Tikkun Olam and being a large entrepreneurship, etc.
So yeah, but I'm gonna get even. We're at the macro level. I want to get micro. There was a system for us to apply. They had systems for going through all of these applications, right? They had systems for eliminating certain applications. There are systems for then communicating to us. They have systems for reserving the hotel, systems for, it's going to become obnoxious at some point. We begin to think about this, but it's a necessary step to begin to frame it for us. They have systems for feeding us here, and they have systems for getting us rooms, and they have systems for, their entire universe is comprised of an infinite network of complex and simple systems. I want to stay with this idea, but move on from ROI. Can somebody else suggest another system? And we're going to try to think about the sub and supra systems that this system exists within. And yeah, that's why we're going to keep on going with it. It takes it's a step. And some people immediately begin to understand it, and some people it takes a little bit longer, and it's not necessarily because a person is smart or not. Some people it's where they come from, and some people just need that aha moment. And that's why we're gonna, it's kind of like when you're massaging something, it kind of hurts, but then you let go and you're like, ah, it'll come in. So can anybody else suggest another system?
Friends, maybe.
Okay. So we have, I'm gonna say a school. That were friends, they're friends in schools, so we'll go with that. So if you think of a school, what are the systems that exist within a school?
Schedules. Schedules, like times for.
Schedules, yeah, sure. All right, so there are systems for determining what classes happen when. And there's also a system, each individual grade is of course a system, right? Each individual classroom is a system. Every teacher has different systems for how they grade, how they give assignments, how they figure out feedback. The school as a whole has systems for dealing with disruptive students. detention, suspension. Schools have systems for giving out and receiving their books. Schools have systems for hiring and firing teachers. I would never want to watch this video because I'm gonna like tally how many times I'm saying the word systems, and it will drive me crazy. But the point is that we have to begin to understand that a chair is a system for keeping our butts off the floor, right? There is a circulatory system in this room which is keeping us from becoming sweltering hot because we're in an area that doesn't have open airflow. Biologic systems. I am a system comprised of a respiratory system, a pulmonary system, that's your blood flow system, a digestive system, the eyeball is a system. The eyeball is most of all a system for capturing light. And then that light is relayed to the brain. And the brain has systems which change that light rather into data that then people can begin to process. All of these are examples of systems. A tree is a system comprised of systems existing within the system of the forest. There's a point when you really begin to internalize this. And for me, it took, I think, 6 months, and from the point where I began studying systems, where it finally dawned on me. And it's that moment at the very end of The Matrix, when Neo looks around and all of a sudden the whole matrix is just a bunch of ones and zeros, greens flashing by. When you look around and you realize that every single thing that around you is in fact a system. Your glasses are a system for changing the vision around you to allow for your eyeball system to interpret it to your brain.
What makes things work.
Sure. Systems are what facilitates and allows for the universe around us to begin to take place. It's a way of understanding complexity. It's a way of taking in information and beginning to understand it. It's to some extent what you call a Weltanschauung. It's a worldview, but it's also more specifically a prism. It's a way by which you can interpret and begin to understand information. I'm going to go ahead and take a step back from systems for a minute, because I'm sure it's getting annoying. And we'll talk about my boy Morty. Has anybody heard of Mordechai Kaplan? We got 1, 2. Mordechai Kaplan is perhaps the single most influential Jew of the 20th century that virtually nobody has heard of. Anybody heard of the Jewish Community Center Network, the JCC associations? His idea. Perhaps even more significant, Kaplan also came up with the idea of the bat mitzvah. His daughter had the first bat mitzvah in history. Later on, he becomes known as the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, but that wasn't exactly what he was all about. He actually he wanted to avoid having to create yet another rift within the Jewish community. Reconstructionist. It's predominantly only in the United States, and it was, and there's some in Israel, yeah. And it was trying to reconstruct Judaism in a way that would be relevant to the 20th and now even the 21st century. His magnum opus was a book called Judaism as a Civilization. He wrote it in 1934. And this was right when psychology and particularly sociology were emerging as significant and influential schools of thought. And what made Kaplan perhaps so revolutionary was that he was one of the very first to employ the tools of psychology, and particularly sociology, to begin to understand Judaism. And he described Judaism using the terms of sociology in an amazing book that is 1,400 pages of incredibly dense writing. He uses very particular sociologic jargon. My vocabulary is pretty good. I have to use a dictionary when I read Kaplan. He's not necessarily the most accessible, but if you take the time to actually break down those paragraphs, they are incredibly rich and they're incredibly relevant. he had tremendous foresight. And the things that he says, some for the better and some for the worse, are oftentimes still true today. And he came to a revolutionary understanding that Judaism is not simply a religion, it's not simply a nationality, it's not simply a culture, but rather it is an evolving religious civilization. And he named his work Judaism as a Civilization. So while I was at Hartman and I was also at Tel Aviv University, I kept on ping-ponging with this idea. And I did one lesson with my colleagues where I talked about the systems that existed in the temple. And they talked about the systems for getting the animals and for the systems for doing the sacrifices and bringing the animals out and cleaning up the blood and purifying the Levites. But nobody really ended up walking away having any idea what exactly it was I was talking about. They were able to identify systems within the temple, but there wasn't really a takeaway. And I realized that I still hadn't reached that point that I was looking for. And it happened about a year ago that a friend of mine, an old camp counselor from Young Judea, of course, recommended that I contact Gidi Greenstein, the founder of the Re'ut Institute, who was looking for somebody to help him finish his book. So his book, which is labeled Flexigidity, which I'll explain in a moment, is driven by primarily these two questions. Can we take a break from my voice and somebody else read the questions for us? Not everybody at once. The first one, yeah.
All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? Mark Twain concerning the Jews.
Same author as Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer wrote a really interesting essay on the Jews, and he asked this question: what is the secret of Judaism's immortality? Right? Because the Romans that live in Rome today are not the Romans of ancient times. The Greeks that are today are not ancient Greece. Virtually none of the ancient civilizations are still around, and yet the Jews are. And the answer is hinted at by, it's actually a reframing by a gentleman by the name of Leon Megginson, but taking the idea of Charles Darwin. Would you mind reading this one as well?
It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. So,
Mark Twain's question is answered in adaptability. It is Judaism's ability to adapt that has allowed for it to continue. Bless you. It is Judaism's ability to adapt that has allowed for it to continue over the millennium of its existence. However, it's not unchecked adaptability, right? If you have just pure adaptability, if you have pure flexibility, right? If it's just pure flexibility, whatever comes up, you change yourself to it, then very quickly you begin to lose that integrity to yourself. It just becomes whatever it becomes, and it's no longer true. So it's the balancing between flexibility and rigidity that allows for a system to adapt, and that balance is flexigidity, and that's the name of the book. Flexigidity there's, by the way, Gidi gave a talk about this where he talks about the same content, and he does about 10 minutes and goes through all of this. We're really going to focus in on just one of these pieces.
Gidi what? What's his full name?
Gidi Greenstein. Greenstein. So the 6 anchors of flexigidity. These are things that allow for keeping it, anchor perhaps isn't even necessarily the best term, we'll explain why, but think for a moment of a skyscraper, right? A skyscraper is primarily comprised of 2 components. On the one hand, there is concrete, and concrete makes it rigid. Concrete keeps it fixed, but it also has steel. And you think of steel as being very hard, but in reality it actually is relatively, it has movement to it. And that steel is incredibly important for a skyscraper, because if you've ever been really, really high up, you might feel a little sway in that skyscraper, because it needs to be able to move with the wind, with the changes of hot and cold, with the motions of the earth. So like that, Judaism also has to have both rigid and flexible components that have allowed for it to evolve and for the system to remain healthy. So think for a moment, if you can, of both, or I can if we can't, rigid and flexible components of Judaism and language. What's rigid in our language? What's fixed and unchanging? Hebrew, right? Hebrew. The language of the Bible is still the same language which is spoken today. Maybe modern Hebrew is a little bit different, but it's still the same language. And we've had Hebrew, we have studied Hebrew for 3,000 years. Through the 2,000 years of exile, we never abandoned Hebrew. But think about the flexibility. Where's flexibility come into Judaism's relationship and Jews' relationship to language?
Yiddish letters.
Yiddish, right? We have hybrid languages. We have pidgin languages. There are almost 30 different pidgin languages that Judaism has developed. Like Yiddish, like Ladino, there's a whole number of other variants which evolved in every place where we lived. And in addition, in every place where we lived, we also found ourselves mastering the lingua franca, right? Every country that we lived in, we would both learn Hebrew, we would also typically develop our own pidgin languages, and we would also always have to be able to use the language of the location.
Extent, because you know they didn't use Hebrew. They used Hebrew only to read the Bible.
True.
It wasn't the.
It was the language for reading. Sometimes it would be used in the Jewish courts for official functions. Perhaps, but yes, very rigid. But it was never abandoned. We always rigidly kept law.
But you did. I mean, when you're not speaking it, you're not. I mean, I think that maybe one of the things that allowed it to stay the way it is for so many years is that you didn't. I mean, we didn't really use it.
True. Sure.
Okay.
But we never gave up the language. We always maintained, right? Think about law. On the one hand, we have the written Torah. The written Torah is Torah shebichtav, is fixed and unchanging. But we also have the Talmudic process. Now, we might think of the oral law, the Talmudic process, as, oh, the Talmud, it's set and it's fixed. But it's, first off, the Talmud itself was itself an example of flexibility. And the Talmudic process is a continuous, flexible process where we find new ways of beginning to apply the law to new realities as they come about. Membership. What's rigid about Jewish membership? How do we determine Jewish membership? Right? We have maternal descent. If you come out of a Jewish mama, then you are a Jewish baby. Fixed, simple, rigid.
That actually changed during the years, but if you think, of course, of 1,000 years, that was
so it happened around the Mishnah, around the time of the Mishnah, which is about it's already fixed into law by the time of the Mishnah, but it's postulated that transition from paternal to maternal descent goes back to Ezra the scribe. It's not entirely around 2,500 years ago. It's not entirely clear, but Judaism that we experience today, that we know today, has a fixed set of, if you come from a Jewish mother, then you are a Jewish baby.
And you have conversion.
And then we have flexibility.
Example of flexibility.
Sure.
Yeah,
Reform Judaism.
Yeah.
like
So,
I converted Orthodox. Therefore, my conversion is accepted by pretty much everybody. It doesn't mean I'm going to get to be get a shit off with everybody, but let's not even go there.
soon by you.
But if I had converted Reform, it would be different. There's a flexibility in terms of the interpretation of what conversion is, and that creates problems in itself.
Sure. And even today, there are the emerging debates within the Reform community about the merits of paternal descent. And people don't necessarily accept that. What we're identifying here are the rigid and flexible elements. And they're both. And they live in constant competition. There's tension. And this tension is permanent. It will never be resolved. One more?
Reality eventually, in the course of time.
No.
No?
Every time that you come to a new reality, it already begins to change. There was a Greek philosopher, I think his name was Heraclitus, I could be wrong, I'm on video, and he said that the only constant is change. And that is true in these regards as well. It's a constant process. In terms of community, one last example, we have on the one hand certain set features, actually no. Yes, we have certain set features of every community, things like schools, things like Chevra Kadisha to deal with the dead. We have things like the mikveh, the synagogue. And on the other hand, if you go around the Jewish world, there is an astounding amount of variation that exists across these different communities. So we have at once the rigid and then the flexible components. All right. So the mission, yeah, we don't want to get into that one because essentially the theory is that there are 4 primary stories that Judaism tells itself. Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Be'eretz Yisrael, so that we are a nation, we are a people, we're a nation with a certain home, we are a people with a common history, we're a religion with a common religious belief, and we also add in the text the belief that Judaism has a responsibility to be a light unto the nations. And so between these 4 different stories, I don't want to get into them, I'm just going to go through them and get on them. Between these 4 different stories, different ones become dominant at different times, but ultimately they allow for flexibility within finding the mission.
They existed separately before modernization, before the Enlightenment? I mean, they existed separately?
The stories all exist concurrently, but they compete for dominance at a given time. And so if you look at the time of the transition to Babylon, all of a sudden the story of nationhood becomes very unimportant. The Babylonian exile, we don't really talk about nationhood for almost 2,000 years, but that story never disappears. It just is quieted for a long time. All right, so I want to go actually move into the text because I want to make sure we have proper time to be able to look at it. I want to do this in traditional Chavruta style, which means that I want to ask you to sit facing each other. We actually have a little bit of space so that you're not next to each other. You can have separate conversations. And it is very important that you take responsibility for the other's learning. Chavruta is a beautiful style of learning. It does not need to be restricted to just classic Jewish text. It can be used in any form of text. And it's a great way of being able to get deeper and richer into text. So if we can go ahead and just line over here and just have facing each other. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we'll have to have one group of 3. And we're not. This is not a short activity. So go ahead and take your time. It's probably 2:10.
Isn't it 2:09?
No, sorry, it's 2:11. It was 2:08 before it got changed.
So the questions about this.
It's 2:08 should be 2:11.
Oh, okay. So
It's a typo.
So we should read the whole thing.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, and then do this.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll read 2:10.
So,
What's 208?
Sorry, it should be 2:11.
oh, okay.
It was it got changed in the middle of the text.
What are we actually doing? We're just reading and...
So yes, go through the whole text, and if there's questions that come up, discussing.
Okay. So should we just continue?
This story determines values, practices,
The loyalty to the land of Israel is rooted in the story of nationhood, one of the 4 meta-stories of the Jewish people. The story speaks about the Jewish people as a nation,
that emanated from the specific territory of Zion, has kept uninterrupted presence in and loyalty to it, and has always sought to return and re-establish its self-determination there. The story determines values, practices, institutions, priorities, and standards which are described at length further in this text. I actually don't take it in very well when I'm reading it aloud, so
Okay.
I can share it with you. Might help.
Okay. So, do you want us to...
Are you not comfortable reading out loud? I can read out loud for you if you prefer.
It's okay. And I think I need some... I mean...
Direction around.
No. I want some clarifications on the text and to think about it. But to return.
About 210?
So what are your questions?
No, I mean...
I will tell you, by the way, this is not easy text, and so I'm still learning how people react with it. So
Okay.
there's no right way or wrong way. This is a great opportunity for me to learn.
Okay. It's good to ask about the stories, information.
True.
Some Jews have even replaced Jewish
Okay.
practices that emphasize their ties to
Meanwhile, Judaism developed an extensive body of theory and practices that allowed for and legitimized life in the diaspora, which has established standards for community institutions such as the synagogue, Beit Knesset, school, communal fund, kuppah, and community, Vav, that are generic and have existed in a broad range of locations. It understands sanctity to be the product of Jewish life and worship, and therefore allowed for religious Jewish life to develop wherever a Jewish community exists. It thus did not limit such life to Zion and Jerusalem. Okay, it's like religion versus flexibility.
It's like
Judaism also developed powerful narratives and narratives that still live in the diaspora.
and then you just ignore it when you read the Hebrew. If you spoke Hebrew, we would understand that. But
Would you like to have any questions? Cool.
Yeah, we're okay.
so this is how it is.
Some Orthodox Jews reject Zionism and the active return to Zion and to the state of Israel, viewing it as an attempt to hasten redemption, Geulah, and therefore as
Heresy.
heresy. The prolonged discourse between the president of the American Jewish Committee, Jacob Blaustein, and David Ben-Gurion on the nature of the relationship between Israel and the diaspora exemplifies these tensions. I want to emphasize something regarding that part. It was, well, anyway, from what I know, and I'd like to, if you can teach me something else, is that for Jews living during the 2,000 years of exile, or religious Jews, like the nationality part and the religious part, or the people part, was more or less combined. I mean, it wasn't even a question. It wasn't really a question around the world, because the creation of nations and countries was actually started like 200, 300 years ago, the Enlightenment. And the weird idea that people of the same culture need their own space and their own system. And I think the first time that the Jews were asked to make this separation, operation, surgical procedure, was in the French Revolution, I think, when the French told them, okay, well, be citizens and religious like anybody else. And so this was the first time. Then you had like the German Enlightenment, the Russian Enlightenment, and you took different.
As I understand it, though the term nationhood, specific in that usage, indeed only comes about then. But what was the kingdom of David? What was the kingdom of? What was the kingdom under the temple? It was a political entity that was a common body with a common law and a common government.
David wasn't in the Judaism.
It's not anymore. Like all of the
time. It was just in Israel. You didn't really have Jews. Like the first time we used Jews, like the Persian.
The term Jew, but the call it whatever you will. It was still it was a proto-nationalist effort, and you also have Jews in the times of the you have the state of Israel. You have the Jewish community in afterwards. We have kings all the way up through King Herod.
If they're true stories.
Exactly. They're living in very
but that's to some extent a moot point. When we talk about the stories that we tell ourselves, those are the stories that we tell ourselves.
I agree.
And so the historic accuracy is, for one, not relevant, but also the historic existence of all of the kings from the Second Temple. They're historically there.
Yeah, you're right.
Let's go ahead and take it to the end there, so and then we'll come back together and discuss as a group.
Should we do 2:11 or do we do
2:13.
Some Jews have even replaced Jewish practices and have emphasized their ties to Zion with practices that stress their loyalty to their place of residence. There are prayers that are synced with agricultural and climate cycle of the land of Israel, requesting rain in the winter and dew in the summer. In the southern hemisphere, where winter is between June and August, summer is between December and February, the traditional does not make sense. Well, that's where I grew up. Well, most Jewish communities in fact
Still at the Harvard Institute? Or you still
No, I'm at the Rehoud Institute now.
You've left entirely? Who was your instructor there?
I had a few different instructors. I was there for 2 years, but I want to do this for now.
performance spaces. Museums,
Polish Jewish histories. Of course, I'm not talking about the concentration camps.
Right. That's a lot of it.
Yeah.
You're what?
The closest religion to Judaism.
So, paragraph 208 said or not 208, it's actually 211. Paragraph 211 describes a lot of the systems that we see as supporting diaspora life. Let me just check to see for understanding. Is the idea of systems becoming a little bit more helpful? Are we beginning to see that maybe a little bit? It's actually not a very good question. So what are the systems that support diaspora life as you see them? So you're saying about how the community is structured in Australia.
In Melbourne.
In Melbourne? Mm-hmm.
There's lots and lots of synagogues. So the community of about 40,000 Jews, there's about 50 synagogues. Almost all of them are Orthodox, which doesn't mean that everybody's Orthodox. There were not that many people were ashamed. And then there's a community centre, and then there's a lot of places of Jewish learning, like a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And there are lots of Jewish schools, like 8.
Mm-hmm.
And then the internet is starting to help things. So there's an Emmanuel's list, and this is how you find out what goes on. It comes out every day.
Do these? Sorry, where are you from? You're from Poland. So do you have similar structures within the Polish community? Do you have synagogues?
Well,
do you have
synagogues? We do have two Jewish schools in the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one Jewish community center. We've got a couple of museums based in one city, and the Jewish community itself.
Mm-hmm. So do you all have, do you know if you have a Chevra Kadisha society which is in charge of burying the dead?
No, that I'm familiar with.
Not that you're familiar with? Hopefully you shouldn't be familiar for a long time. Chances are you do, because it's very hard to have a Jewish society without it, right? You need to have the ability, that's one of the first responsibilities that a community has. When you establish a new community, you have to make a cemetery. It's actually like,
See, this is interesting to me because I grew up in the Reform movement. I didn't even know what it was until I was much, much older. I don't think Reform Jews do this. Like, or if they do, they might, but like I've never even heard of this concept until I like met my like Orthodox people when I was older.
What concept?
Hebrew Kadisha.
I'm Reform as well, but I think you can hear about it when you need it. So
Yeah, it's possible, but even like people, I like, you know, family members or people I know, I was unfamiliar with that word.
Even if it changes, right? You still have to have some way that you deal with.
No, there's definitely a system in place to like handle mourning and handle burial and handle, you know, Shiva and everything. Like, I just didn't know
Which
that
is, of
concept.
course, to me, perhaps the most beautiful of all of Judaism's systems, and it's the one that, in the end, oftentimes brings people back to Judaism when they've been distant for a long time. The system for dealing with loss, right? So first, you have a week, and you have a whole number of systems that are set up for that. You're not supposed to care about what you look like, so you have blankets over the mirrors, and you're not supposed to worry about cooking, so people bring you food. And then after a month, there's the systems that happen for a month, and you're not supposed to shave if you're a guy, and you're not supposed to listen to music. There's what you're supposed to do for the week, the month, the year, and these are, you know, structured. Now, whether or not people choose to engage with all of them.
Term. Like, it's possible that I just didn't know what that word was until
Certainly, yeah.
Well, here in Israel, only the only funerals.
Yeah, that's, of course, no. Anywhere.
I don't think anywhere. The community.
They just basically take care of the call.
Yeah, they watch over the body, they prepare the body, and the burial. Do you think that any of these systems are under strain in your communities?
Yeah, I mean that's for me. That even just personally, I think a lot of these things are under stress and.
Could you elaborate, please?
Breakdowns, and then it's interesting about where it produces and goes from there. So territory around Israel. I mean, I sit on I work for a Jewish board, and so you've got a board of people that express varying degrees of Zionism and affinity to the land, and when we are faced with big challenges in South Africa of people being against Zionism as a concept, it's hard to combat, and people have an extreme lack of knowledge. I'm shocked. We really need to bring everyone quickly to Israel just to educate them whether or not they agree in Zionism, because the lack of knowledge. So knowledge is breaking down something, but Zionism.
Which would imply that there's problems within the schools.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And a continuing education through your life, continuing access points to Judaism and Zionism. I left all organized Judaism and contact with Israel for 15 years, and I wouldn't have come back if I hadn't happened to get a job in the community.
I know, and I was telling them how about in the States, like the federation system is it really, like, so the federation system is the system of like 150 local bodies that fundraise to support like elder care services in the Jewish community and social services and job training and nurseries and schools. Like, they're basically the people that fund all the other Jewish institutions in a community, and they're losing a lot of relevance and traction because nobody under the age of 35 knows who they are. And so they can't fundraise anymore. And a lot of people under the age of 35 think they're antiquated and don't understand why they exist, and think like, I could just give my money directly to all these places and I don't need somebody to filter it through for me or make these decisions for me. So that's like an institution from like the 20th century in America that is like one of the biggest Jewish institutions that is now as a system like largely thinking of largely.
I think it's the same with all the big institutions.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Same with Jewish Agency and Keren Sod. They're all going through the same process.
Remember how you were saying before how...
Foundation.
I'm sorry. You were saying before how, well, it gets to a point and it gets there, but what really actually seems to be happening is that they got to a point and they created these systems like the Jewish Agency, like the federations, and they exist for a while, but then the circumstances begin to change, as is constant, and you have to begin developing new changes, new systems.
As Zion as the land of Israel. I mean, as long as all the Jews were in exile. They could long to Israel, they could dream of Israel. Now when it exists, everybody has opinion about it. I mean, even before that, I mean, it could be a Zionist, it could be non-Zionist. And I think also that if you live outside of Israel and you still think Israel is the center of Judaism, and I think Judaism has many faces, then it's very hard. I mean, I can understand logically why a person who lives outside of Israel, in order to feel complete, need to cannot see it as the center of Judaism. I can understand that completely. I mean,
okay.
Otherwise, how can I continue to choose this way of living? I can, of course, totally relate to the other way of thinking, but I can understand that too. I mean, it's something that you need to justify your choices in life too. I mean, even for that, and not for an ideology or.
And the
Israel is
There, it says in the book of Bamidbar, in Numbers, it says, and make for me a dwelling place, and I will dwell within them, in the plural. And that's one of the ways that people in the diaspora understand it, is that vasuli mikdash, and you should make me a holy place, in the singular, and I will dwell betocham, in the plural, which would imply there would be multiple ones. And it gives the implication that it's actually, we all have the ability, both within ourselves, but also as communities, to make places of Kedusha. That's one of the stories that strengthens that diaspora narrative that you were hinting at, right? And one of the things that he was talking, that we talk about there in 2:12. I argued with Giddy for a while about that one until I found sources that actually were were able to back it up. Because it does say in Ketubot that all of the lands are as dough, which implies that they're soiled a little bit when compared to the land of Israel, and the land of Israel is like dough compared to Babylon. We actually do have that already happening during the time of the Talmud, where people are talking about and praising diaspora life, which is certainly contrary to the primary Zionist narratives that we have today. So I feel like we're still very much exclusively in the realm of theory. So I want to show you all some stuff now. It's to take away. You're not going to be able, by any means, to digest it all right now. To begin to try to apply, how can systems thinking begin to help us? Because people are using this in fields, as diverse, as I said, like business, like education, like government, military. So my teacher's a guy by the name of Draper Kaufman. He grew up in the military. He served in Vietnam himself. And when he was a high school teacher, he wanted to begin teaching his 10th grade class about systems. And so he wrote a book called Systems 1 and Systems 2. Systems has been around for really around 40, 50 years, but it's begun to come into its own in the last 10, 20 years. He wrote this book actually in the 70s. And so what I'm going to share with you is the appendix to it, and it's a list of kind of guides for thinking in systems and shortcuts for modalities, if you prefer, for how to things that can help you frame it. And a lot of these are probably things that you've come across before. Right? So when you begin to think in systems, you realize, oh, by the way, I didn't even point out to you, the structure of the book of Flexigidity is ideally, you should be able to read, if you want, only the bold sentences of each paragraph without actually having to read the whole paragraph itself. If you don't want to have to hear all the details, and that's the Re'ut structure, that's how Giddy always writes. Interestingly enough, Draper writes the same way. So all of these different rules that you see here, you can get them at a glance if you just want. Everything is connected to everything else, right? You can continue to read on, or you can just go straight to. You can never do just one thing. Anytime you affect one part of the system, it will always come out in another part. So therefore, there is no away. Skipping down to number 6. All right, when you're beginning to think in systems, you have to remember to realize it ain't what you don't know that hurts you, it's what you do know that ain't so. All right, so you have to begin to think about what are the things that you take for granted that may or may not be true. Obvious solutions do more harm than good. It's a whole set and structure, a beginning of a way to try to understand complexity and begin to try to understand and begin to develop strategies. Obama is very much a systems thinker. Whether or not you like him is irrelevant. He definitely tries to understand complexity and tries to appreciate that you can't just come in and make one small move, right? You come into Iraq, it is ultimately has ramifications that we're still seeing play out in the Middle East today. Sometimes it takes more than days, weeks, months. It takes years. It can take decades. But when you think of the Middle East as a system and you begin to see Saddam Hussein's statue topple in Iraq, it sets the stage for things that are happening today in Egypt and even perhaps in Turkey. I think I've talked a lot. I don't know if I want to talk anymore. Are there any questions that you'll have about this, about anything else?
So I have a question. It sounds like we all agree that like the systems in our communities are like strained. Like we all can identify, no matter where we live, like that the structures that have supported our community as we know it, like for the past century or less, or 50 years or 20 years or 10 years, are changing rapidly, and I'm sure we could identify all the causes for that. Like, but when those, I guess, is the implication that if those systems are strained, then like new systems emerge? Like, is that the implication that like new systems, like how can you start to identify the new systems that come out of it, I guess? Or is that part of this process?
Like, when a system is under stress, like,
does it auto-correct itself, or does it get reinvented, or does it disappear entirely? Like, what happens when a system disappears?
So in that, you begin to touch on the inherent perhaps contradiction or irony of the text, because on the one hand, Flexigidity argues that Judaism, and by the way, Judaism is problematic when you talk about it. The Jews, Jewish civilization, the Jewish system, right?
yeah,
Because it's not simply.
I completely agree with what you said before.
The Jewish system has this incredible autocorrect ability to it, right? Which is balancing the flexible and the rigid. And from these parts all together, it emerges.
Until now.
At least until now. And so that should, on the one hand, give us cause to hope that, okay, we can just go on and we'll just wait for them to go. What Giddy claims, and I agree with him, is that we're living in a time of what we refer to at Re'ud as change in the nature of change. And things are happening even more rapidly. And we need to adapt while still maintaining integrity to the system, perhaps even more quickly. I do not claim to have the answers. But what we're trying to do
That's what I came here for.
What we're trying to do in the Flexigidity project is trigger the conversation, because we have faith in the system's ability overall to find the questions, to find the solutions. And so if we can begin to get people to have conversations around these topics, you just said, okay, so we all agreed that that the systems in our community are under strain.
Right, but I actually,
But before we can say that, as a community, first off, people have to begin to think about the systems that exist within our community. And people aren't talking about that so clearly yet in terms of that. When we can have a common conversation and we can begin to talk about, okay, what are the systems? Why are they under strain? Why are they under strain? Then we can begin as communities. And it's not necessarily the same in Poland as it is in Argentina or Venezuela, or as it is in South Africa, or that it is in anywhere. Every community might have different necessities, but there's oftentimes knowledge and transference. That's the big overall lesson of systems thinking that I don't think I actually said yet, so I'm glad it came up.
So if you don't, I mean, the study of the systems, like, doesn't get you to a new system, just like you are not like, you don't think about how to create a new system, but just to think about the systems that are already created. Like,
So here today, I've been more trying to focus on thinking in systems, because that itself is not, it's not always obvious.
I want to share something with you. I'm a
Please.
secular rabbi. And
You're sorry, what?
I'm a secular rabbi.
Okay.
So if you're talking about rigid and flexibility, this is
A secular rabbi. What does that mean?
well, yeah, what does that mean?
In short, it's a person who deals with the culture of secular Jewish people. I'm trying to fill the gap of what secular Jewish people do believe in, and not only what they don't. So that's more or less what I do. And one of the rules that I set in my work is what I do believe in, what should be in this service, or what should be the value in the basic principles of what I'm doing in each activity. But I'm constantly dealing with tradition versus flexibility. And
You mean like religious or cultural tradition, or both?
well, I think I'd like to refer to this cultural tradition because it includes the religious too.
Okay.
So, and I must say that you've sharpened a thing for me. I mean, I think that this tool, I mean, only, you just gave us just a feeling of it. For me, it actually kind of helped even in that level, because I think as a tool, it might help me in observing or analyzing the systems that I do appreciate and the ones that I wish to change. So I don't know, maybe if that answered
No, I know.
your question.
I mean, I guess it's something that we all think about sometimes, and it's so hard to put in words. So definitely this helps.
Yeah, I also think what it's also like, I'm rereading this now, and there's like, we talk about, okay, synagogue, school, fund, and the committee. Those are 4 things that any number of systems can be built to support, right? Like, so the federation system that I'm talking about in the States is the system that we've invented to handle the communal fund. And while that system may be dying or whatever, there's still going to be some way that the Jewish community in the States tackles this issue of the community fund. Like, we might invent a new system to handle it.
It's adaptability.
Right, yeah, and it's interesting because like these seem to me to be like the constants that like are always underpinning a Jewish community, but like the systems that we build to address them are the things that appear to be changing.
On the other hand, in Israel, we don't really have synagogues as a center of the community. I mean,
And it's changing in the States too.
We do have synagogues, but for religious people. Sometimes secular people go there in certain times in their lives or during the year, but it's not really center of a community. And I'm asking myself for the last few years if it is a necessity, and maybe I'll
So
think about it as a system. Do we need this system or not? I mean,
So there's 2 things. One, something I should have made more explicit, but I think you're beginning to get a hint of anyways. That one of the reason that people study systems is because of what the idea of what's called transference. Knowledge of one system can oftentimes lead us to understanding of another system. Social to social, and even biologic to social, and social to biologic. Sometimes, not always. So that's just a big meta idea to take with you.
Examples of organization.
Right. So if I really my buddy Irv, he's my dog. He's my favorite bar mitzvah student ever. I prepared him and his granddaughter for his second bar mitzvah and her bat mitzvah. He's adorable. So Irv volunteers with a Better Business Bureau, and he helps people from a variety of different businesses that are looking. He just volunteers with them. He was in scrap metal, but he understands business systems, and those are common throughout different business. There's transference of that knowledge. If you really understand informal education, knowledge can apply to formal education and vice versa. That's one thing. Previewing what we don't have here in the text I gave you, Giddy does assert, and I think that there's substance to it, that to some extent the state of Israel has challenged and has even sought to undermine some of these systems, and the systems that really supported the Jewish communities through the diaspora.
Or incorporated in the system of the country, of the government.
So what happens in his understanding is that basically a lot of these things that were in the community's responsibility were taken over, as you said, by the government. And what happens in the financial crisis that plays out in the 70s with the change of government, so the change from a socialist to a capitalist system in '85, is that a lot of those underlying supports for the society were just dropped altogether. And if you frame it like that, well, that is actually one of the underlying causes of the tent protest that only fully emerges in 2011, but is a product of things that have happened to the system radically before. We're not going to walk out of here with answers. I didn't have that expectation. I never really had that goal.
Our lives like more complex now.
Perhaps at first. Perhaps at first. Right? So, and it takes a moment, and it takes a moment to where you can begin to do that, and you look at that phone, and you look at that light, and you look at the fire extinguishers, and that screen that comes down in the air. Everything, the entire universe is comprised of an infinite network of complex and simple systems. And when you can begin to understand that and internalize that and stop being distracted by, there was a point where I was like, oh, system, right? That tells you how to escape. That tells you how to leave the door. I mean, and then there's that moment where it quiets and it allows for you to begin to understand complexity in a slightly different way. We live in an incredibly complex world. We are being bombarded with images and ideas all the time, and we need to be able to create lenses, both filters but also lenses that allow for us to see the underlying and overlaying structures that give us that frame our world, that can allow us to find higher points of leverage to enact the changes that we want to make without necessarily negatively impacting the parts of the system that strengthen us and give meaning and give resilience to both our lives and also our Jewish system. So as I said, I look forward to never watching this and counting how many times I said the word, but I hope that while you're in the room as you're going on, you can begin to think about how people use their voice within a speech to create a whole idea, and how the microphones and the videos and all of these things are examples of systems. And when you can internalize that, it will allow for you to understand things not just within your Jewish world, in any of your professional and personal and private, right? My family, you saw the beginning there, we are a system within a greater system, etc. But also that it can begin to help you think of solutions, begin to help you. Before, though, you can begin to think of solutions, you have to really understand what it is that you're looking at, and then you can begin to try to figure out what it is that you're trying to do. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.